I'd like to thank Doug for that very kind introduction and thank the NSCA for having both Meg and I here today. This afternoon we're going to talk a little bit about power development. And I can tell you, to really do a good job, we need to be here about 3 weeks, but hopefully we'll get out in 50 minutes. The first thing we need to do is go through a few definitions here. And the first thing we need to understand is that strength is an ability. It's an ability to produce force. Force is a vector quantity, so it has a direction and a magnitude. But one of the things that we all need to do is stop thinking about strength as how much can you lift. In other words, maximum strength, because strength is really a vehicle. And it transports some other things with it. Not just force, but also there's a duration to it. So there's an impulse. We have a rate of force development, which is the change in force over the change in time. Also, if you produce force and it's dynamic, there's going to be an acceleration. If you multiply that acceleration times time, we get velocity, which is basically displacement divided by time. And then we come down to power generation. Power generation is a work rate. I would make the argument that if I can get the work done faster than you can, I win. So it's a very, very important characteristic. We can also think about it as force times velocity. Now, to get this started, we need to go through some biochemistry. And we need to ask a speculative question. Is the velocity of a muscle fiber limited? And if it is, how can we enhance power in that muscle fiber? Well, if it's limited, if you look at the formulas we have there, you've got Newton's second law and you have the power equation. Force is a primary factor in both of those. So one thing that we might think about that if the velocity is limited is working on force output. But the first question we need to talk about is skeletal muscle velocity limited? Now, we know from enzyme kinetics, if we take a look at myosin heavy chains and so on, and we look very closely at the rate of cross-bridge cycling, we know that cross-bridge cycling is related to the dissociation of ATP and so on down the line. But basically, that cross-bridge cycling rate controls the velocity. Okay? So that means that if we consider muscle fiber types, you can't go faster than 2x. 2x has the highest myosin ATPase. It has the highest cycling rate. I don't care what you do to the fiber, you cannot make that muscle go faster. We can make it go slower, but we can't make it go faster. Okay? So one of the things that we can do to slow it down is to alter the myosin heavy chains. That is, in a sense, and notice I'm saying in a sense, change the fiber types. And if we increase the volume of training, and it doesn't seem to matter what the training is, weight training, sprinting, endurance, whatever. If we get enough volume, we start shifting the myosin 2X heavy chains towards a slower type. And then if you decrease the volume, it tends to come back. We'll talk more about that later on. So we can make that fiber slower. So, because the maximum shortening velocity appears to be limited, then efforts to increase power output need to start focusing on force. Now, here's another part of that question. If you think about it, when a muscle contracts, it's not just type 2 fibers, it's not just type 1 fibers, there's a mixture of fibers in there. So one of the things that's also possible is that as that mixture of fibers starts contracting, the slower fibers actually create drag and friction and slow down the faster fibers. Okay? And there is evidence for that. It may be because of friction, it may be because of drag. Another possibility is what we might term indiscriminate hypertrophy, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But one of the things to think about, if type 2 fibers are faster than type 1 fibers, If I increase the cross-sectional area ratio of 2 to 1, I should be, in a relative sense, be able to overcome some of the drag created by the type 1 fibers. So an important characteristic here might be to develop the 2 to 1 cross-sectional area ratio. Now, we know from several studies that when you do specific exercises, you get specific results. And those results show up in terms of tissue architecture and where that hypertrophy actually occurs. It's been well known for some time. We also know that the structure that's laid down as a result of that affects the function. So if we take a look, for example, at a track cyclist, and this is Fosterman from Germany. If you take a look at his legs, you'll see that he has quite a bit of hypertrophy through the entire quadriceps. In fact, he can squat 300 kilos. Okay? Down at the bottom, you see Usain Bolt. And if you notice, most of the hypertrophy in sprinters is up in the upper part of their leg, in the proximal portion. And that's because if you put a lot of hypertrophy down here, you've got to lift that. It changes the moment arm. And so one of the things you might not want to do in sprinters is put a lot of hypertrophy down here, indiscriminate hypertrophy. Okay? And there's both inter and intra-task specificity, and we have to consider that. We'll come back to hypertrophy in just a few minutes. Now, as the muscle shortening velocity appears to be limited by the myosin heavy chains, and type 1 fibers may inhibit type 2 velocity characteristics, then we need to think about other training strategies besides just working on velocity or power output all the time. One of the things that we need to consider then is actually working on the force characteristics, force generating characteristics of the muscle. In other words, increasing strength, increasing maximum strength. So from a performance standpoint, we need to think about getting athletes stronger. From a physiological standpoint, yes, we need to increase the cross-sectional area. There is evidence that we need to increase the 2 to 1 ratio, cross-sectional area ratio. We need to be careful about it in terms of indiscriminate hypertrophy. And also, the nervous system plays a role. And we'll talk about some of those in just a few minutes. One thing that has come out just in the last few years, maybe through training, you can actually change fascicle length, in other words, the number of sarcomeres in series, which would make the cells contract faster. However, that's still up in the air as to whether it really occurs or not. All right, so let's just go through a general overview here. First of all, is power important? Well, here's a study that compares the power output from a half squat, so the maximum power in half squat, versus the season's best throw among hammer throwers, discus throwers, and shot putters. And you see there a strong correlation. So in that particular case, power output is obviously important. Here are 3 other studies which took a look at power output from a jump squat, this is in watts per kilogram, versus the sprint times in short sprints, 5, 10, and 40 meters. And again, we see strong correlations between the two. We also find that there are good relationships between the mean power produced in a squat at the optimal loading, and also the peak power produced in a counter movement vertical jump at 20, 30, and 40 kilograms of load, and your ability to repeat short sprints, at least among soccer players. So again, power output appears to be quite important. This is kind of an interesting study. It took place in experienced rugby players. And what they found was, along with experience, power output was a primary factor in the ability to tackle. So we see that power output is quite important in a number of activities. Okay? So let's begin to talk about the theoretical aspects of development. One of the things that I want to caution, I always tell my students this, when I talk about theoretical, That doesn't mean this is an idea. This means it has backing. There's actually theory to it that is backed by evidence. Here we see from some reviews of the literature by Minetti and Zampero. And in these reviews of literature, not only did they review the literature, but they also did some mathematical modeling. And they were interested in how do we best produce power. And basically what was found was this. The first thing that they suggest that you need to do is change the cross-sectional area of the muscle. In other words, build the engine. Then work on strength, and then in a specific manner, work towards increasing power. Okay? If you think about that, that also comes back to what has been discussed in terms of periodization for power output, particularly the idea of block periodization. And we can see here that the basic idea is to increase the muscle mass, change your ability to work, increase work capacity, work on maximum strength, and then work on power in a specific manner. So the theoretical and the practical go together. Yeah. Now, we need to consider, if you're going to develop power, first thing is I hope you begin to think in terms of long-term athlete development, because power development really starts early. One of the first things that you need to do is make sure that physical literacy is developed and that you also have good exercise technique. By physical literacy, this is what we're talking about. There are certain things that need to happen when you're a child. If you don't learn how to crawl and walk and skip and gallop and throw and so on, you're going to have problems later on learning some of the more complex athletic movements, including those that include high power movements. And so we need to learn these at critical ages. And these are quite important, or you won't be able to do certain things later on in terms of sport. Now, this is a statement from a review of the literature by Andrew Sandberg. And basically what he's saying here is the old adage of a bicycle. If I learn how to ride a bicycle when I'm 9 or 10 years old and I ride it for several years, I can get off that bicycle for years and then get back on it, and within a couple of weeks I'm riding about as well as I ever did. So we can learn things early on. If you learn them well, they stick with you in terms of motor control technique. But notice also he's saying up here that in terms of things like strength and endurance, if you don't continue to train them, they disappear. That doesn't necessarily happen with motor control and technique. If you think about that, that begins to tell you if you learn the technique wrong, it sticks with you. And it's very difficult to change. But if you learn technique well, then you will increase the probability of exercise progress. In other words, you'll progress in that exercise better than you would have otherwise. It also raises the potential for transferring to some other activity, and it decreases the injury potential. Now, if you're interested in long-term athlete development, it's a very important concept, and I hope some of you will take a look at some of these reviews of the literature. Now, the second step then is going to be trying to develop the contributing characteristics or contributing factors to power. And here we basically see them. One of them is, in fact, muscle architecture, tissue architecture, and changes in cross-sectional area. And then we have changes in the nervous system. If you do these things right, if you improve them through appropriate training, then we can enhance force production, okay, from 0 up to 100%. We can enhance neuromotor control. We can enhance your ability to handle a stretch shortening cycle. We can improve coordination, and so on down the line. But that depends upon really three important factors. One is genetics. The second thing is are you integrating these training programs properly, and are you producing good training programs to alter these factors? And also, do you have a good strength coach that knows how to do that? So they're very important factors there. In terms of genetics, it depends upon two factors. One is, does that athlete have genetically linked physiological characteristics that are advantageous, for example, more type 2 fibers? But the second thing is equally important, and perhaps more important. Everybody has a window of adaptation. Some people, because of their genetics, have a larger window of adaptation. It's the people who have both of those that make it to the elite level. All right, so our second step then deals with changing cross-sectional area, also perhaps changing work capacity, although we're primarily going to talk about changing cross-sectional area, working on the nervous system, and altering maximum strength. Now, one of the questions that I often get asked is, how much does cross-sectional area versus the nervous system contribute to improvements in force generation? And the answer is, we don't know. And one of the reasons we don't know is not well studied. This is the only study that we've been able to find that actually tried to investigate this. It's a study done back in 1989 by Narisi et al., in which he took relatively trained males, and which way do you go to get back? That way. All right. He took relatively untrained males, and there were only 4 of them. He trained them in a typical kind of bodybuilding manner for 60 days, and then had 40 days of detraining. And through EMG and some other methods, they concluded that in terms of after 60 days, that cross-sectional area contributed about 50 to 60% to the changes in force production, maximum force production, and the nervous system about 40 to 50%. One of the things, though, that you could argue, and I think holds some weight, is that as time goes by, cross-sectional area becomes less important because it's harder to develop, especially if you're in a body weight class sport. And so the nervous system later on may be, even though it diminishes the amount that you can change it, may be a primary factor. All right, let's talk a little bit about hypertrophy then. So we are at this point in our paradigm. Here is a study by Hakkinen et al., and they used strength athletes, which were primarily weightlifters and throwers. They had some sprinters, and they had some endurance athletes, which were primarily distance runners. And these were national class athletes in Finland. And what they found was a strong correlation between cross-sectional area and how much force they could produce at maximum in a leg press. But they also did something kind of interesting. They compared the ability to produce force in newtons per kilogram. And if you notice here, the strength athletes were stronger than the sprinters, who were stronger than the endurance athletes. So the question is why is that? Well, if you think about it, they've normalized it in terms of cross-sectional area. So that leaves a few things, muscle stiffness and so on, but it also leaves the 2-to-1 ratio, and it also leaves the nervous system. So in another study, this lasted 16 weeks, where they actually trained the subjects. One of the things they took a look at was the 2-to-1 ratio and its relationship to a power movement. And what they found is that as the 2-to-1 ratio cross-sectional area increased, so did their static vertical jump, an estimate of power. So there's evidence here from this and other studies to suggest that the 2-to-1 ratio is quite important. So how do we change the 2-to-1 ratio? The best way is through a good strength training program. And there is good evidence, and this is a study by Campos et al. Back in 2002, And we can see here that as a result of strength training, the type 2 fibers hypertrophy at a faster rate than do the type 1 fibers. And there's a number of good biochemical reasons for that, and here are some reviews that deal with that. So a good strength training program can begin to change that. There is also some evidence, primarily from work by Häkkinen again, to suggest that among athletes who use higher power movements on a regular basis, like weightlifters, they tend to have even larger 2-to-1 ratios, which would give you an advantage. Okay, so just a practical note here in terms of gaining cross-sectional area. If you go through scientific literature, it generally tells us that volume is a primary factor, the amount of work that you do. Now, beware, because while there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that more repetitions per set might be advantageous for beginners, there really is no evidence to suggest that any single set repetition is advantageous for advanced strength power athletes. The overriding factor seems to be the total amount of work that you do. In fact, there is a study showing that weightlifters, powerlifters, and bodybuilders, if you take the same muscle that has been used by both groups, you have about the same hypertrophy. The 2-to-1 ratio may be different, but the cross-sectional area of the muscle is about the same over a period of years. Now, there may be, in terms of optimum hypertrophy, an intensity threshold. Schoenfield thinks it's around 60% of the 1RM. Andy Fry thinks it's up a little bit higher, around 75%. So in other words, to get optimum hypertrophy, the biggest growth, not only do you need a large volume, but you might need to handle somewhat heavier weights, loads. Let's talk just a little bit about neural factors. Based upon the literature, we know that strength training, when appropriately applied, we can change a number of factors. Remember, strength is a vehicle for many different characteristics. And so we can change, for example, the frequency with which we recruit motor units, rate coding. We can change movement coordination. We can enhance synchronization, which is quite important in ballistic movements. Very importantly, we can increase rate of force development with strength training. We can enhance the ability to use stretch shortening cycles. And eccentric strength is particularly important there. And we can change the inhibitory aspects of exerting force. So the bottom line is here, we do these things, and we do that through a change in maximum strength. So let's talk then, since strength is an important component of this paradigm, let's talk some about the relationship of maximum strength to power. So now we are over here in our paradigm. We know that there are strong relationships between maximum strength, rate of force development, and power output. In fact, among weaker athletes, which most Division I athletes are, then increased strength, working on increasing strength produces as good or better increases in rate of force development and power than does power training. And there are several good studies showing that. And if you haven't read Prue Cormie's Studies in Medicine, Science, and Sport, it's worth reading. We also know, as a result of the strength training, that stronger athletes have an advantage in gaining power. And there's a number of studies dealing with that. In fact, Greg Hoff has just recently completed a series of studies dealing with that. So let's take a look at those relationships. Here we see maximum power, and again, this is the jump squat versus the 1RM squat normalized for body weight. And we see very strong relationships here. There are a number of studies which show strong relationships between the production of power in a number of ways, everything from vertical jumps in a Smith machine to arm curls to free vertical jumps, weighted vertical jumps, and so on. And there are strong relationships between power output and maximal strength. Stronger people produce more power. Interestingly enough, there have been a number of studies in which not only have they shown this relationship, but one of the interesting things they did in these studies is divide the subjects, and in some cases these were athletes, into strong and weak groups. And so we see here, for example, in these studies, we can see that there is a stronger and a weaker group. And in every case, the stronger group produced more power. So there are good relationships between strength and power. Now, an important factor is not just the relationship, because that doesn't give you cause and effect. So do we have longitudinal studies? Yes. This is a study that just recently came out by Lawrence Seitz, one of Dr. Haas's students. And in this study, they did a meta-analysis of various studies looking at the 1RM squat and its improvement and their improvement in sprinting. And again, you see here strong correlations between the improvement in the squat and the improvement in the sprint in terms of effect size. Now, again, in terms of longitudinal work, this is from Widrick, and this is kind of interesting because they actually use single fibers, and you can, through, it's a fairly hard technique, but you can actually tease out single fibers, test them in a force transducer, and you can come up with the force and velocity and power output, and then you can fiber type them. And so they collected a number of type 1 fibers pre-post training and some type 2A fibers. They didn't have enough fibers for 2X, so they used 2AX. But what they did here was kind of interesting. They took these fibers and they equalized them based on cross-sectional area. And you can see here that the amount of force that was, the force enhancement was different. They all had force enhancement, but it was somewhat different. And we see here that the power output was also somewhat different depending upon the fiber type. All did the same training. What this might mean, and notice I said might mean, is that if you have an athlete that predominates in one fiber type or another, one type of training compared to another might produce somewhat better results. We still don't have enough evidence yet to say one way or the other. Here's another study by Kaneko et al. And this is quite interesting because they compared different methods of training. And if you go through that study, they had several different, I'm going to show you two here. In this particular study, they had the subjects train 3 days a week, and they did repetitions at 100%. They were spread out so that they could do the repetitions at 100% of their strength. And they trained them over a period of 10 weeks. They had another group that used 60%. What's kind of interesting in this particular study is we do see some specificity of exercise here. Notice in the high force group, they improved in force more than that group did. Their velocity also improved. This group improved a little bit more. But the interesting thing is, notice they both improved the same amount in terms of power. They got there by different combinations of force and velocity, which suggests to us that that can occur, that we can have different combinations of force and velocity and yet come up with the same power outputs as a result in terms of training effect. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the rate of force development here because it's extremely important in terms of changing power output. We have evidence that indicates that, in fact, the rate of force development may be more important in terms of eliciting adaptation in power and also velocity than velocity of movement. Okay. If you consider this, load-limited maximum effort slow movements elicit high rates of force development. Remember, rate of force development is not velocity. So you can have a heavy weight, and as long as you're making a maximum effort, it might be moving slow, but there's a high rate of force development. If you think about this, this might explain why, as a result of heavy weight training, we get increases in velocity and power over a wide range of loads. So for example, here we have a power curve. And we can see here's a peak in that power curve. And so we've got a load range down here, and here's power output. We have two basic windows for adaptation here. One of them is at the high force end. So if I get stronger, I stretch this. I can now produce power with weights that I couldn't even move before. So I've opened up this window. The second window is down at this end, and this depends upon the rate of force development. The higher we can get the forces here, the quicker we can get them up high, the more up and down this curve becomes. And so we've got a better chance of doing that by opening up both of those windows. And one of the things that we know is that in relatively weak people, athletes, we can, through strength training, attack both of those windows so that we now can increase the peak power and also the range over which we can produce power. Okay. So, we know then that maximum strength levels dictate both the range of loads over which we can produce power and at least to an extent the upper limit, that is the peak power, by opening up both of those windows. We also know that stronger athletes have a more favorable neuromuscular profile. And that serves as a basis for further increases in power output when we actually start emphasizing power. So among novices, really in this case, a second step in increasing power is to get maximum strength up. We always have to remember this though. Maximum strength trainings will increase power. There's no question about that. And in fact, in weaker athletes, it will do it as well or better than power training. But one of the things we eventually have to do is when we reach a reasonable level of strength is start thinking about training or emphasizing power output in training. Okay. Now, just a practical note. If you want to increase maximum strength, if you don't remember anything else I say, remember this. If you want to be strong, lift heavy weights. There is no way around that. You can go in the weight room and fool around with light weights and you'll get stronger, but you won't ever really get strong. Okay? So if you really want to get strong, you've got to lift heavy loads. And there is evidence for this, that heavier loads produce better effects. And much of that deals with what goes on in the nervous system. Okay? So our third step is then actively developing power production. Okay? So now we are over here. Okay? Now, one of the things we just talked about, and again, we don't have enough time here today to really discuss this, but how power is developed might really be critical to sports success. And if you notice up there, we've got three different paradigms. You've got times velocity, you've got force times velocity, and you've got force times velocity. Okay? So we could use different loading on the bar and remember, or whatever, and we can produce the same power outputs. And we can increase to the same power output in terms of an adaptation. We saw that earlier in Kaneko's paper. This is an important idea because in one of those, for example, that one, we could increase strength and power at the same time. Okay. Now, this is a paper, it says 2013, it's actually 2015 that Dr. Hoff and I have coming out shortly. And what I want you to note here is, here are some weightlifting movements. If you look at the power outputs, they're just as good as these things down here that are unloaded, and far better than what you would get in typical powerlifting movements. Okay? So we can produce high power outputs with weightlifting movements. Okay? So would weightlifting movements be advantageous? And the answer is yes. This is a study by Trickley. Okay? basically untrained subjects. I believe they were physical education majors. But what Trickley did was divide them up into two groups. In one group, which he called the weightlifting group, notice they did high pulls and power cleans, clean and jerk, and a half squat. The other group did typical plyometrics, double leg bounds, hurdle hops, and so on down the line, and also did a half squat. At the end of this training program, which I think was 9 weeks, what they found was that in a variety of variables that you see here, that ranged everything from static jumps to long jumps to 10-meter and 30-meter dashes and so on, the weightlifting group produced better results. Okay? So there we see that, again, these weightlifting movements, which in a way are a combination type of training. You get higher forces and you can get reasonable velocities and you get very high power outputs. That when you use those, you can produce as good or better effects than what we do from typical power training that we think about. Okay, so if we want to put this together, let's go back to a study by Harris et al. This was actually carried out in 1999 and published in 2000. This, I think, is an important study. One, because we actually use real athletes. This was the Appalachian State football team. And we had 51 players there, and they were performing sprint and plyometrics and so on along with this. And it was integrated into the program. And you'll see what the tests are in just a second, but we tested all the measures at the end of 5 weeks. We did the 1RMs, and then we tested all the measures post. Everybody, all 51 athletes had gone through 4 weeks of a strength endurance type program, sets of 10. And then they were switched into one of 3 groups. One of the groups did heavy weight training, although there were heavy and light days to manage fatigue. So everything was at about 80% or above here. Another group was switched into a power group. Most everything here was at about 30% or less. And then there was a combination group. And for the first 5 weeks, they trained like this group. In the last 4 weeks, they trained in a real combination, where they would even do some clusters and so on, complex training. So we've got 3 groups here. There's one group, all of them finished a strength endurance phase where they did sets of 10. One group was switched into a strength training group where everything was 80% or above. The other group, and I'm running out of battery here, the other group was switched into a high velocity, high power group, 30% or less. And then we had this third group that actually did the complete block. So they went from the strength endurance to the strength to the combination. Okay. And what we find is, if we go through these variables, and you can see we did everything from 1RMs in the squat, quarter squat, mid-thigh pull. They did a vertical jump. We had a power index, Margarita-Kalaman test, so on down the line, 10-yard agility run, 30-meter dash, and so on. In the majority of the variables, the combination group did a better job. They had a greater improvement. In terms of effect size, if we look at the 1RMs, this is in the squat, we see that the combination group was just as good as the high force group. Now, all of them improved. That group barely improved. These 2 groups improved quite a bit over that period of time. If we consider the vertical jump, again, this group improved quite a bit, but these groups, percentage-wise, improved just as much. Okay? Something that was kind of interesting. Both of these groups in the 10-yard dash got worse. The combination group got better. That by itself wouldn't have excited me too much. But what was kind of interesting was when we looked at the 30-meter dash, 10-yard shuttle run and a 30-meter dash, is the same thing happened. Again, suggesting that maybe this combination has an advantage. Okay. So, in addition, we have evidence that exists that suggests that strength training plus reasonable levels of sport practice offer some advantages than just strength training alone or sport training alone. And then, as we just discussed, the combination of strength and power training may offer some advantages if you put it in the right sequence. There is also a lot of data existing dealing with delayed training effects. What I'm doing in the weight room right now may not show up for weeks or even months. In fact, Abernethy from Australia has information showing that the lag time in some cases may be as long as 6 months, depending on what you did and the level of the athlete. And what you find is the higher the level of the athlete, the longer the lag time. Okay? So that delay is partly re-educating. You've made the motor units stronger. Now you have to relearn how to use them in the performance. Now, let's talk just a little bit about the idea of functional overreaching and tapering, because this is important in terms of reaching peak powers, especially at the right time. Now, here is an important paradigm. Here we see the degree of alteration, at least qualitatively, and here is training volume. One of the things that we know as we increase training volume is you accumulate fatigue. You get tired. And that masks, this is the fatigue fitness paradigm, that masks fitness. But here are some of the underlying physiological changes that take place. One thing that we talked about early on is that we get some changes in myosin heavy chains. And what you find is that as you increase the volume of training, type 2A fibers increase. And we see the type 2X fibers, the faster fibers, actually decrease. There can be, if you do it right, some positive alterations in the nervous system. There can be some positive alterations in the cross-sectional area, changes in the 2-to-1 ratio, and so on. Now, what happens as you decrease volume is these things begin to turn around. Okay, there's some deterioration. So the one thing that takes place is accumulated fatigue begins to diminish. That's a good thing. We also see that the myosin heavy chains begin to reverse. And now we see a decrease in the type 2A fibers and an increase in the type 2X fibers. In fact, 2 of these studies, one of them in sprinters, very good sprinters, actually showed an overshoot. So they ended up with more type 2X fibers than they started with, which means you've got a lot more or more faster fibers. The muscle is probably going to contract faster, have a higher power output. But the interesting thing here is, as you decrease volume, notice there begins to be a diminishment in these other aspects. But the catch is here, if you do things right, the positive alterations in the nervous system, the positive alterations in cross-sectional area persist longer than the alterations in the myosin heavy chains. So you get a faster fiber coupled with the positive alterations in the nervous system, the cross-sectional area, and you get a peak in performance. Okay? Now, obviously there's some adaptations that take place back over here that cause those things. If you think about that, we could then use that to our benefit in training, not just in the taper, but actually training. And that brings up functional overreaching or planned overreaching. If you do things right, you should be able to increase volume, and you have to increase it quite a bit. You disturb homeostasis. You have offered a stimulus to that athlete, and it needs to be a big one. But it can't last too long, or you go into non-functional overreaching where things don't turn around. So, if we do that right, performance might actually fall off during that period of time. But if we bring this back down to our normal levels of training, now we start seeing a change in performance, and that may be coupled with some changes in testosterone and cortisol. If we then add a taper on the end of that, we may get an even bigger boost. But one of the things to think about, and we do this on a regular basis, one of the things to think about, let's take this part right back here. If we put that into training on a regular basis, okay, now we may get a bigger adaptation than if we had not put that overreaching phase in. But you have to be very careful. If the extent of the overreaching phase is too great, then you've pushed them over into non-functional overreaching or even overtraining. Don't do that. It's not good for you. Okay? It's very difficult to recover. So the time span needs to be rather short, perhaps a week or two, and you have to be very careful about the amount of volume. So what about increasing power in your athletes? Well, I would argue that in relatively weak athletes, and I will argue strongly that most D1 athletes and D2 and D3 athletes are weak. And we've got the measurements to show it. Most of the time, they are going to benefit a lot more from a good strength training program. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't do some power training, but if you strength training, they'll benefit more from that than they will from power. But at some point, in relatively strong athletes, we need to think about emphasizing power training. That does not mean that you should abandon strength training. If you do, eventually power will fall. As strength falls, eventually power will fall behind it. Okay, so there's a strength maintenance program. Now then, how strong is strong enough? Okay, that's always debated, but I can tell you, in terms of the squat, for example, there is good data. In fact, Dr. Hoff just completed a series of studies taking a look at this. There is good evidence that if you can't squat twice your body weight, you're not strong enough. Everybody says twice your body weight. That's not very much, folks. I promise you, twice your body weight is not hard to achieve, okay, for anybody. Now, that's based on the ability to potentiate. People who can squat twice their body weight can potentiate better in potentiating schemes in terms of what they derive from plyometrics. For example, depth jumps, people that can squat twice their body weight are more likely to derive benefits from that than weaker people. In fact, Hakkinen showed that back in the early 1980s. Okay? So about twice your body weight. So that brings us back to this paradigm. And I would argue that if your goal, and it should be your goal, at least with what we term strength power athletes, your goal should be to increase power output and do it in a specific manner. So we're back to our paradigm. If you want to do this well, the first thing that you do is work on body composition and try to get their cross-sectional area up, and particularly the 2-to-1 ratio up. There is some evidence that higher power, higher velocity movements might do that better than the typical slower movements, or at least using them some of the time. Okay, you've got to get their strength up, okay, and then you work on power in a specific manner.